Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 6, where the ark finally comes to a new home. Now, 1 Samuel, you had started off the book of 1 Samuel with the birth of Samuel, and then it had been followed by Hannah's song of thanksgiving. When Samuel grows up a little bit, he hears the voice of God. And remember, that's what the name Samuel means. Shema is to hear, and the El is short for Elohim. That is the word for God. Next, there's war with the Philistines, and that ends in failure, and the ark is captured. The next section after that is what I call the travels of the lost ark, where the ark is taken down to the land of the Philistines. Meanwhile, in 2 Samuel, we're going to see that same general pattern, not a birth, but the death of Saul. That's followed by David's song of the bow. So again, a song is sung at length. Next, David listens to the voice of the Lord, not that he hears him directly, but through an intermediary. There's war with the Philistines, but this time it is a successful war. And now we're going to read about the ark coming home. Again, the travels of the ark of the covenant. 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 1, Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baal Judah. That's Baal, just the word for Lord. Don't think the pagan god Baal necessarily when you see that. To bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. Notice how the ark represents the Lord who is enthroned above the cherubim. Now, the cherubim refer to the statues of the two angels that are on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, and that signifies the place where he is enthroned, the place where he sits. The Ark represents the very throne of God. And so this ark that represents the throne of God is now going to be brought to Jerusalem. Now, it was supposed to be brought, and when it was supposed to be carried, it had long poles, a bit longer than probably is shown in this picture. And the priest would carry the Ark of the Covenant to wherever it was going to go, but the Philistines had sought to move it in a different way. Remember when it had been captured by the Philistines, they had put it on an ark drawn by oxen and sort of shooed them on the way, and so it had come up to the land of the Philistines. As we get now to chapter 6, verse 3, we read that they placed the ark of God. They didn't want it on that old cart, which the Philistines had used. That's quite old by now. That was back in the days of 1 Samuel, back in the days before Saul had become king. Now they placed the ark of God on a new cart that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, he's the high priest, and so these are sons of the priest, they're leading the new cart. Verse 4, so they brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark. Verse 5, meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of instruments made of fir wood, and with lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. It was a noisy and joyful approach until something quite terrible happens. Verse 6, but when they came to the threshing floor of Nachon. Now, when we compare this with 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 9, it's going to read, when they came to the threshing floor of Kidon. It's probably just another name for the same place. You have place names that can get a new name. That probably happens in Chronicles. So same general place as a threshing floor. We read that Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen nearly upset it. He didn't want to see it bouncing down the hill, so he reaches out to try to stop it from falling over. Oh my goodness, and now he dies. Verse 7, and the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and the Lord struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. I don't know that he had an intent of irreverence, but it was an act of irreverence to touch the ark. It was supposed to be handled in a very proper way. This reminds us that the Lord takes seriously both his worship and how we are to treat those things that are dedicated to him. And I would suggest that God calls us to worship in a very specific way, that he gives us instructions about worship, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that we're not just to worship any way we want. We are to worship in those ways that have been regulated by the scriptures. In fact, we call that the regulative principle of worship, that we are to worship God in the ways that he has determined, that he has set forth, that he has established for his worship. Verse 8, David became angry because of the Lord's outburst, and there's going to be a play on that word against the Lord's Perez, his outburst against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah, the outburst against Uzzah to this day. Now remember, we saw that same word, an outburst against the Philistines, in the last chapter, but now there's an outburst against Uzzah. Verse 9, so David was afraid of the Lord that day. Notice there was both an anger, or we could call it a trembling, but also a fear of the Lord. And he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? And so everything is put now on hold. Verse 10, David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. Apparently this is a location that's right there nearby. Verse 11, thus the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Apparently he is treating it reverently. Nobody else does. And instead of death, instead of bad things, there are good things that come upon his household. Verse 12, now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. And David went now and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. The rejoicing is back. The cart is gone. I'm sure they're not using it. Verse 13, and so it was that when the bearers of the ark, nobody has it on a cart anymore. Instead, it's being borne the proper way. When the bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. They are being careful. They are being reverent. They walk 6 paces. It reminds me of the 6 days in which God created the heavens and the earth, and then on the 7th day he rested. 6 paces, and then they sacrificed an oxen and a fatling. Verse 14, and David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. Now, an ephod is a outer covering over top. For example, the high priest would wear an ephod over his robes, but this is a linen ephod. Think of in terms of maybe like a poncho. It doesn't go all the way to the floor. And to wear this as your covering means you're dressed down a bit. Verse 15, so David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet, and everyone is happy. Well, almost everyone. Verse 16, then it happened as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David that Michal, the daughter of Saul, remember Michal had been given to David in marriage after killing Goliath and after his winning a big victory over the Philistines. But then Michal had been taken away when David had become a fugitive, had been taken away and married after someone else. And then David said, now that he becomes king, I want my wife back, and she had come back to him. But we hadn't read how she felt about all of that. And now she looks out of the window and she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, dressed in the linen ephod. And we read, she despised him in her heart. Now, I don't want to give the motives of this hatred, because frankly, I don't know what's in her heart, except that it's hatred. She looks at him and she looks down on him, maybe comparing him with dear old dad, with dear old Saul, who had died. And yet there'd been a time when she had hidden David from Saul so that he could flee alive. And yet now we see a change of attitude. Verse 17, so they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. I'm not sure if this is the old tabernacle, a new tabernacle, it's certainly a tent. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Verse 18, when David had finished offering the burnt offering and the peace offering, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Further, he distributed to all the people, to all the multitude of Israel, both to men and women, a cake of bread and one of dates and one of raisins to each one. Everybody gets to eat. It's worship by eating. And it reminds me a little bit that we're called to a table where we worship by eating. We eat that which represents the body and blood of our Lord. Well, all the people departed each to his house. And so we saw in verses 1 through 19, the ark comes to Jerusalem, but now we're going to see Michal. She both had disdain, and she's going to express that disdain now, whereas David has shown his joy in the Lord. And so in verse 20, when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David, and her words are going to reflect a high level of sarcasm. She says how the king of Israel distinguished himself today, and that's not really her meaning. Her meaning is quite the opposite, as seen by the next line. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids, as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself. She has looked at David, and she says, you're not acting kingly enough. And David's response to her, David answers verse 21, so David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will celebrate before the Lord. I don't need to put on airs before God. God is God and I'm not. Verse 22, I will be more lightly esteemed than this and will be humble in my own eyes. And that's okay. But he says, look, that's not the way other people saw it. But with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be distinguished. I'm not doing anything inappropriate with the maidens. I'm not doing anything appropriate with anyone else. But I will humble myself before the Lord. And that is David's attitude. Verse 23, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Was this David's doing? Was this God's doing? She becomes the humbled one, humbled because of her disdain. Whereas David, who had humbled himself before the Lord, will be the exalted one. And that reminds us of the greater son of David, the one who came in all humility, who was born into a poor family, who suffered, who died on an ugly cross, who took upon himself the greatest humility so that he could be risen from the dead in great victory and raised to the right hand of the Father.